Well, I'm Kevin, and the pastor here, but I also lead a rooted group. Julie and I have been leading this group. Somehow we happen to get the best people in our rooted group, so that's an awesome thing. And this money talk, we actually talked about before this filming thing. So even though I'll be doing probably all of the talking, they have participated in some of the information that I'll be passing along. Our memory verse for this week comes out of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus taught a lot about money, and on the topic, one of the strongest things he says is in the Sermon on the Mount. And so he says in Matthew 6:19, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And I think that a lot of that is an obvious thing. I think most of us know that stuff on earth doesn't last forever. We've all had sort of the experience of buying something new and then having the newness wear off, and eventually it's something that we throw out. And so that's not a super surprising thing to say. But what Jesus says about it connecting to our heart is something that we need to at least be reminded of, if not just taught explicitly, that that's a really important thing, is that our finances, our money, have a way of getting to our heart. There's a story of this young guy who is an investment banker, a really wealthy guy on the fast track, and he was driving his BMW through sort of these mountain passes, and he's going too fast, and he loses control, and as the car goes out of control, he's sort of thrown out of the car, and the car goes off the cliff and down the cliff and bursts into flames, and he's badly injured, but he loved this car, and so he sort of, struggles to look over the side, and he's looking down, and he starts just moaning that his brand new BMW is destroyed. And some guy that comes up to help him looks at him and goes, "Pal, you've got a bigger problem than that." And sure enough, he looks down, and like his arm has been ripped off of his shoulder. And he goes, "I got to get you to the hospital." And the guy starts moaning again, and he goes, "Oh no, my Rolex." So come on, you guys, give me something here. That's so great. All right, that's the only joke. That's the only joke we've got, so we're good. But, it really is true that money has a way of becoming way too important to us. And a lot of times we stop with the passage that we read from Jesus here. But it goes on to make a really interesting observation. And because it's sort of hard to get, a lot of times it's not taught. But in the very next verse, in verse 22, it says, "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" So Jesus makes sort of this obscure statement now in the middle of talking about money, that how we see things is so important. And I think he realized that money getting a grip on our heart is not just dangerous, but that it's subtle. That a lot of times we do not recognize when we're becoming greedy. In fact, in a teaching in Luke where he's talking about this very same thing, he says, be aware of greed. Set your guard against greed. And I think the reason for it is not that greed is necessarily the worst of all sins, but it may be the most subtle. In fact, I'll bet that during your Strongholds week, I bet you not one of you said, "A stronghold for me is greed." And the reason is not because none of us struggle with greed. We probably all do. It's that we don't see it in ourselves. We can see it in somebody else, but very often we'll compare ourselves and say, "Well, I don't have as much as they have," or "I'm not as greedy as they are." And so Jesus just sort of calls us out on that and says, don't be foolish. See that for what it is. Make sure that your eyes are light when it comes to this topic. He goes ahead and he closes by saying this. Again, kind of a famous statement. "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And of course, he's talking about two dynamics that are super important for us, things that we need to deal with both. If we're a Christian, we need to deal with God, and we have to deal with money. But he makes the point that it's very dangerous to put them on a level playing field because they won't stay there. One will always take the lead over the other. And one of the things our group did is we spent a little time talking about what it looks like when either sort of money is driving your life or God is more driving your life. And the way that we worded it is, what does it look like when I focus on riches for myself versus when I focus on building riches toward God? So here were some of the things that our group came up with when we talked about this, and I think that it's helpful. It sort of answers the question, am I slipping into greed? Is money becoming too important to me, or is God getting the right place in my life? So the first thing that we talked about is symbols of wealth. When symbols of wealth become really important, having new things, having the latest and the greatest, when it's important to us that people look at us and say, wow, that's a nice car, a nice house. Those are the kinds of things that probably indicate that we're a little bit too consumed with riches. We talked a little bit about struggling with debt. When you spend more than you're making, that's a sign that money may be too important. Going into debt is an indication that you're not trusting God for the amount you have and you're trying to get more. Finding your ultimate security in stuff. And when we do that, we tend to worry a lot about it. So, when we find ourselves staying up at night a lot, worrying about money, really concerned about what's going to happen. There's times where that happens probably to all of us, but if that's an ongoing pattern in our life, that's probably an indication that money's become really important to us, maybe too important to us. And then if generosity is a hard thing for us, if we just have a hard time giving for a reason other than what benefits us directly, and maybe a one-off from that is the idea of when we give, it's pretty calculated. Yeah, I give, but it's because I'm getting a tax write-off. Or I give because it kind of looks good. Or I give because that person may eventually give back to me. Those are indications that really money might be the most important thing, too important to us. So that was sort of our negative list. But then we also talked about what does it look like in our lives where we're being rich toward God. And the first thing really is that we understand that God owns it all and that we are stewards. And I think we hear that a lot, but to really understand that God actually does, it's all His. And He allows us to use it, but we're responsible to it. That's sort of the foundation maybe for being rich toward God. Not living above your means, again, just having the discipline not to go into debt. That I know it's tough to do, and especially there are some times where maybe it's unavoidable, but in general that's not the way you're living. We talked about really believing that God will take care of us. And again, it's kind of a subtle thing at times, but you will probably be able to determine it in how much you worry about money. And just talking, one of the people in our Rooted group was just sharing that a breakthrough for her was realizing, because she stressed a lot about money, a breakthrough was just realizing that God lives inside of her. So of course God would take care of these things. And it really just has radically shifted the way that she thinks about this stuff. And so that's an indication of being rich toward God. Another thing we talked about is just being generous, maybe kind of unreasonably generous, looking at a need and it doesn't really fit in with your financial plan, or it may even mean some bit of sacrifice for you, but you say, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do it. I want to do it. And that is an indication that you're being rich toward God, that you're really trusting Him, and that money hasn't put too much of a grip on your heart. And then kind of the final thing we talked about was that God calls us to invest kind of in His kingdom building mission, that He has this kingdom building mission, that He wants to expand the gospel. He wants to expand it in our hearts and our lives as believers and to non-Christians and to other places in the world. And that an indication that we're rich toward God is that we actually like participating in that. We consider it an honor that God would invite us into that adventure and that we are going to invest. And the church, I know, talks a lot about tithing and things like that. And, and that's certainly part of it. But let me just talk to you for a second about what tithing is and isn't and all that kind of stuff, just because I think there's so much confusion, and maybe there's confusion here at our church. The tithe is an idea that comes out of the Old Testament, And it's just basically the idea is that you give 10% of what God has supplied you with. This is not an idea of sort of giving back to God a portion of. Sometimes you hear offerings introduced that way. And that's not stewardship, because stewardship is God owns it all. We're not giving anything back to God. Rather, it's this idea that we're investing in this project that he has called Extending My Kingdom. And he says, basically, don't give because you're expecting something more back from me. Sometimes that happens, but you give because I already gave to you. I've already blessed you. It's not that I'm going to bless you in the future. And again, sometimes he does that. But I think a lot of the teaching that we give today is you can't outgive God, and you need to give because he's going to, for every dollar you give, he'll give you $10 back. And that's just not real good biblical theology. The thought about giving is God already gave to you, so why don't you give a portion to his project? So anyway, 10% isn't really taught in the New Testament that much. It's kind of assumed, and so most people say they're comfortable with that. But here's the truth of it. For some people, 10% is not enough. If it's not a sacrifice to give at all, and you're giving 10%, it doesn't impact your lifestyle, Jesus would probably say, well, you could probably give a little more then. You probably should up that a little bit. It should have an impact a little bit on what you do and don't do. And I think conversely, I think there's times where we're in a place in our life and giving 10% just is not possible at this point. And so giving something less, but giving it with the right motive, with the right heart, maybe with the right desire to increase that giving is a beautiful thing, and that should also be celebrated. Another question that sometimes comes up is, should all the giving come to your local church, in our case to Ridge Point? And believe me, if there was a verse that said that, I would quote it right now, because I'd love to have all of your giving come to Ridge Point. There isn't. And so I do believe that your local church is a place that probably should get maybe the lion's share, because this is the group of people you've decided to build God's kingdom with, and giving to it is important. But Julie and I give to other organizations, and we consider it just as important, and we're excited to do that. And so, I think the idea is make sure that you're giving and giving sacrificially. Of course, give some to your local church. Maybe you give all to your local church. But you shouldn't feel like, the first 10% has to come to church, and then anything above that, tithes and offerings, that's just, I don't think that's biblical. So anyway, a little bit on that. One other thing too is, if you're in a place right now where this is brand new and you've never given that much, the first most important decision you can make is just to start giving something. Everyone says the first decision to go from a zero giver to a something giver is the biggest decision you'll ever make. So making that decision is a great start. The second most important decision is going from just giving sort of irregularly and certain, whatever you feel at the time, to actually planning your giving and giving a percentage of what you make, percentage giving. And so if you're not giving anything, a great first step, give something. If you are giving something, but it's not regular percentage, then give percentagely. And even if that's a start under 10%, you can give at that level and then start raising that as you go. And I think all those things honor God. The last thing I want to just say is, as the pastor of Ridge Point, I really want you to give for two reasons. And the first reason is the most important. Giving something, when you give your money, which is precious to us all, and we all have other ways we can spend it, and we all work hard generally to get it. When you give that, you truly are honoring God. And I think it's the reason Jesus talks about it so much, is because when you give something that really means a lot to you, it is an act of worship. And it is a way of saying, God, I love you, and I love you even above my money and my things. And so just for spiritual health and for your walk with God, and as you're going through Rooted, as you're trying to think, how do I make real steps forward, starting to give, or giving more, or giving to the point of some sacrifice, is one of the most important spiritual disciplines you'll ever have. And God will bless you for that. There's no question, not just money blessing, but he blesses us in so many ways. But the second thing I'll tell you is, I believe that Ridge Point is a great place to give, because I think that God has given us an amazing vision. We have a desire to build the people's lives in our church. So like when we do Rooted, Rooted costs money. And so when you give, you are giving so Rooted can happen and life groups can happen. And so our students, we can build into our 300 students that call Ridgepoint their home, or our almost 500 children that call Ridgepoint their home. It also allows us to do ministries like up at Brooks Prison and overseas in Honduras, and all the things we're doing down in Pullman. All those things cost money, and so when you're giving, you're helping. But I'm so excited because I believe that God's given us this really giant vision for the future that has to do with planting churches and going into communities where there isn't maybe a local church that is really expanding God's kingdom, and being able to plant these churches and raise up leaders and send people out from our campus. And to be honest, that's a real expensive enterprise. As we do that, that will become one of the major things that we give to. And so when you give to Ridgepoint, you're not only continuing to build the things that we get here in this church, but you really are laying a path for people all over Western Michigan, and we hope really all over the United States and even the world, to find Jesus and to grow in that. So we're excited. We're excited when you give, and we're excited to talk about money and just be a church that's extremely generous. Anyway, that's all I got to say about giving and money and all those things. So thank you for paying attention.